Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Fox, and welcome to a special edition of Beyond the Noise. Our goal for the Fox Alliance is to offer insight into big economic themes. Our topic for today is global trade in the crosshairs, the Houthis, and the new maritime Flashpoint. Today, we will be discussing the history of the Houthis, the significance of the Red Sea Suez Canal conflict in global trade. What are the implications of the conflict? How does the hostility affect global inflation? What lessons do we learn from the conflict? Our panelists will be speaking for about 30 minutes, and we'll have questions after that. Our compliance does not allow us to have the chat feature. So if you do have any questions, if you could email me, bill@thefoxalliance.com. Our presenters today will be Max Clark and Laura Cooper. They are two of our financial advisors. And following that, we'll be hearing from Josh Renfro, our managing partner. Max will be our first presenter. Max, take it away.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. We are grateful that you guys have chosen to join us this afternoon. I think the best place for us to start as we talk through what's happening there in the Red Sea would be to understand the history there in Yemen. Yemen is where the Houthis are currently located, and they kind of arose as a result of the Yemeni civil war that is currently underway. This civil war started back in 2014 and is not yet resolved. It arose from long-standing grievances between the northern part of Yemen and the southern part of Yemen, and really came out of the 2011 Arab Spring. When all that occurred, protests all around the Arab countries, protests really just exploded there in Yemen as well, and ultimately led to the removal of the then President Ali Abdullah Saleh. And his Vice President Hadi, took over control of the country at that point. Now, in the midst of that kind of power vacuum, the Houthis, who are a Shia Muslim group from the north, they used that opportunity over the next several years to fight their way to the capital of Sana'a. And they captured the capital in 2014. Now, this really concerned their neighboring country, Saudi Arabia. If you look in the upper right-hand picture there, the map, you can see that Yemen is just south of Saudi Arabia on the Arabian Peninsula there. And in 2015, Saudi Arabia really stepped in with a coalition of other Arab states aiming to put down this civil war or this rebellion against the current government and reinstate the ousted government. Saudi Arabia was particularly concerned because the Houthis specifically are backed by one of Saudi Arabia's main enemies, Iran. So let's take a look here quickly at kind of the key players in the conflict there in the Yemeni civil war. So you can see down here kind of in the bottom left, the larger circle would be the Houthis, and they currently control Sana'a, which is the capital. And they are backed by Iran, which is obviously a big concern to Saudi Arabia. The other major player would be the current, or I should say the contested government of Yemen, which is led by Vice President Hadi and his aligned forces. And they are backed by Saudi Arabia, who also has the support of the United States, Great Britain, France, other European countries, and many other Arab states as well. There are a few other players that complicate the whole situation. I think probably the most significant is the STC, which stands for the Southern Transitional Council. The United Arab Emirates also backs them. They're basically a separatist group that is also trying to vie for control in this whole situation. But here's where things stand currently after 9 or 10 years of war. It's still a lot of division. And if you take a look, the pink or purple color there would be the legitimate government or the original government, which would be led by Vice President Hadi and backed by Saudi Arabia in the West. They currently control about 55% of the country. Now, where the population is really most dense would be on the western part and in the capital there in Sana'a. And you can see that 25% of the country in the green is controlled there by the Houthis. And then the kind of southwest portion is controlled by STC, or 20% of the country, the Southern Transitional Council. Now, where do things stand currently? At this point, there has been really no resolution. There's stalemate on the battlefield, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. And we are still seeing some airstrikes by Saudi-led coalitions and occasional Houthi attacks on Saudi territory. But at this point, efforts to negotiate some sort of peaceful settlement have really proved futile. And it's been, honestly, a humanitarian tragedy there in Yemen. We have seen one of the largest outbreaks ever of cholera. There is widespread hunger and thirst, and it's a real humanitarian tragedy, and something that we really hope is resolved quickly. Now, what's occurred here and kind of what's led to these attacks in the Red Sea really began with the Israel-Hamas war. So we all know that back in October of 2023, the war began there in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. And the Houthis, who are aligned with Hamas, really saw this as an opportunity to kind of catapult themselves onto the global stage and really expand their fight against Saudi Arabia and its allies. And so they began attacking ships in the Red Sea, kind of in solidarity with with Hamas. And they were basically saying that we'll continue these attacks, and have continued to say this, we will continue these attacks until Israel stops their war against Hamas. And the key area where this is becoming a problem is, you can see here this red circle. This is where these ships are being attacked. It's right here in the Bab al-Mandab Strait between the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. And obviously the Red Sea comes up here kind of towards the northwest and goes through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean Sea. But you can see this darker region here on the map is the Houthi-controlled area, and you can see they have direct access to this Bab al-Mandab Strait and have created quite a bit of attacks and disruption there in that area. So these attacks have mostly been drones and anti-ship missiles launched either from the land or the sea. And initially, they were focused on vessels linked to Israel, either sending supplies or cargo to Israel or from Israel, some sort of connection to Israel. But that's later been expanded to include ships from various nations. I think one of the most prominent examples from last year was the Galaxy Leader. This was a vehicle carrier, and it was en route from Turkey to Indonesia. Really no connection whatsoever to Israel. And the Houthis boarded this vehicle carrier by helicopter, and they hijacked it. You can see a picture of that occurring in the upper right-hand corner. And they took that ship and its 25 crew captive. And to our knowledge, they have yet to be released. You might have seen news just this morning and last night that the Houthis again attacked another ship, essentially rendering it almost incapacitated, so much so that the crew actually abandoned ship. So these attacks are still very much happening, and it's something that has yet to be resolved. Now, what's happening on the international side is there's been widespread condemnation of the Houthis for their attacks. The West, which has been largely led by the US, but some other European countries, have initiated a series of counterstrikes to destroy military capabilities, really with the goal of not putting troops on the ground. Objective, of course, is destruction of drones and unmanned aerial vehicle ground control stations, those sorts of things. And that's what their focus has been. There was an attack actually just yesterday in that area on a underwater vehicle of some sort that the West initiated. So lots of involvement from the West, not yet clear on how this will play out. But this is the current state of things and how we got to where we are today. Now, with that, I think it'd be valuable for us to shift over, and I'll turn it over to Laura to talk about the importance of the Suez Canal and the Red Sea as it relates to global trade. So, Laura, take it away.
Thanks, Max. Perfect. Okay, great. So let's start with taking a look at why the Suez Canal is so important. So the Suez Canal is operated by the Egyptian state. It's a canal that connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. And as we'll talk about here in a second, that canal leads into an artery, if you will, that is super important for maritime trade. So that in 2014, the Suez Canal Authority, or the SCA, widened the canal to increase daily capacity from 49 to 97 vessels by 2023. And that was a cost of about $8.2 billion. The Red Sea also is one of the most densely packed maritime trading vessels in the world. So incredibly important to connect Europe to Asia and Eastern Africa. So as far as how many ships move through the Red Sea each year, about 65 vessels pass through the canal each day, or 23,851 vessels per year. So pretty significant amount of trade. Represents 12% of all global trade and 30% of all container trade in the world. And then looking at different commodities that are transferred through, so about 7 to 10% of the world's oil, around $1 million barrels a day, are transferred through, 8% of the world's liquid natural gas. And in 2019, 53.5 million tons of ore and metal were transferred through, 35.4 million tons of coal. The more interesting number here, though, is this one right here: 4 times the tonnage transiting the Panama Canal in the Suez Canal. Obviously, the Panama Canal connects the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean, technically, but significant amount of tonnage actually going through this canal each day. Great, and with that, I'll turn it over to Josh to talk about the implications of these attacks.
Thanks, Laura. Appreciate it. So, a couple of other facts. Actually, can we go back? There we go. So, one of the biggest reasons we wanted to focus and talk about this topic is just understanding that ships are a really cheap form of transportation. As an example, if you compare shipping via ship versus aircraft, it is 12 to 16 times more expensive to ship via airplane compared to shipping via boat. Even when you compare railroad or truck to boat, ships are simply by far the cheapest way to transport large bulk material around the world. And so understanding the cost structure that ultimately plays into that is key. And so with the issues and the military conflict that are occurring right now in the Suez Canal, it has resulted in the insurance for ships and those costs going up pretty dramatically. So just as an example, if you looked even just prior to the Israel-Hamas war, the cost for insuring a commercial vessel with about $120 million worth of cargo was about 0.05% of the total cost. If you compare that to what it is today, it has grown to 0.7%. So we're talking about over 1,000% increase in the cost to insure these pieces of cargo. And that is with still very little damage having actually been done to the ships at this point. We're still, this is obviously an incident, but it's the costs could jump much more if we actually started to see more vessels destroyed and cargoes destroyed and insurance companies having to cash in more significantly on those costs. And we were seeing this even further when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We've seen that Russia has deemed Ukrainian vessels that are transporting grain from Ukraine to the rest of the world as military targets that can be considered. And as a result, insurance premiums on ships coming out of Ukraine have gone up to 2 and 3%. So another 300 or 400% above what we're even seeing right now in the Suez Canal with the Houthi crisis. So insurance premiums and insurance costs can make a big difference. And just as an example, that adds about $800,000 of cost to the transport of vehicles today. Implications. At the end of the day, the easiest one to recognize is inflation. So right now, what's had to happen because of what's going on in the canal is about 80% of the vessels have chosen to go around the Cape of Good Hope, and it's added between 16 to 14 days to the trip. It's about a 9,000 additional kilometers that they have to travel. That adds a lot of expense to the mix. You have to pay crew for an additional week to 2 weeks of travel. In some cases, you have to have, not in some cases, in all cases, you have to have additional fuel in order to supply those vessels. And in some cases, you may even have to reduce or change the types of things that you're transporting. So the costs can be quite dramatic. Now, in terms of how do we actually anticipate that inflation coming into view? First off, and probably the most pressing question that you are asking is, will this likely affect the US? Of the cargo that goes through the Suez Canal, only about 20% of it actually makes it to the US. The overwhelming majority is going to Europe or from Europe over to Asia or the Middle East. And so we expect that the majority of the inflation will probably be limited to the European sphere as well as the Asian sphere. But we will still ultimately see some of the impacts of these higher insurance costs and transportation costs being passed on in the form of inflation and the cost of goods. So that's one thing that's important to recognize. There are a couple of other implications that we want to think about, which is, at the end of the day, expansion of a military conflict is also a key issue. We have begun to see, at this point, the U.S. is involved in the Ukraine-Russia war. We also have the U.S. now involved with the Israeli-Hamas war, and now the U.S. has expanded its theater of conflict to yet another sphere, which is dealing with the Houthis and trying to stop the interference with global trade. The challenge is, as we continue to expand the conflict spheres further and further, the chances of it getting into a larger military conflict with a major superpower, as opposed to Hamas or the Houthi, which are smaller military forces, we risk engaging with a larger group like Iran, as an example, or another Middle Eastern power. So those are risks that we think are important to keep an eye on. But the last thing that I would like to wrap with is, and this is honestly, as I mentioned, one of the bigger reasons we wanted to talk about this topic, is one of the most underrated risks in the global economic system is the cost of shipping around the world. This is really the first time in probably 6,000 plus years of world history where we have seen the cost of shipping be very, very, very small, to the point that insurance companies are willing to insure ships for a cost of 0.05% of their cargo. And that's because throughout most of human history, there wasn't one major global power that basically kept the seas safe. We've seen that since World War II, the United States, in conjunction with its allies, have done an excellent job of keeping the seas safe. And as a result, piracy's impact on trade, and also smaller regional wars' impact on trade, have been very negligible. Why? Because there's been hardly either of both. We've seen very little piracy impact trade, and we've also seen regional wars be very, very small and usually limited to small areas for short periods of time. We've begun to see a shift in the US's posture on the global stage. It is no longer the global hegemon that it once was. With the rise of Russia and China as global superpowers, and the US's decision to really keep more of its military efforts protecting specifically its own military interests, which I'm not here to judge that one way or another. What I am here to say, though, is we've started to see a little bit of the tension arise to the top. And we're starting to see the cost of shipping and some of these other things go up. And one of the biggest risks, in our opinion, moving forward could be if we see additional regional conflicts start to erupt around the world in different areas, it could start to cause the cost of insuring ships to go up. It could even cause certain shipping routes to not even be viable as an option, therefore permanently increasing the costs of certain goods. When we think about inflation, oftentimes we think about the cost of labor and other things like that as the major contributors, and those typically are. But we have developed, through a very complex system of shipping operations, the ability to move goods very inexpensively around the world. But at the crux of being able to do that is our ability to count on the fact that piracy and wars will not impact shipping. That is an assumption that we think there's a chance that the Houthi Israeli conflict could begin to test the validity of that assumption moving forward. Because when you have shipping costs that could go up by 5, 10, 15, 20% because of the risk of cargoes being destroyed, that meaningfully starts to change the cost of goods that are going around the world. So this is really honestly the biggest thing that we hope that people pay attention to, is not simply this specific conflict itself, but what it really points to, which is the risk that the global trade system has when you consider the costs that can arise because of military conflict. And so with that, if we have any questions, we will open it up for those.
We do have one question. So it says here, there's a rusting ship full of oil that is chained in the Red Sea. Its destruction would decimate the biology of the Red Sea, including some warmer water coral reefs. It's under the control of the rebels, but I can't remember who. Remember the Houthi, perhaps Eritrean rebels? Is this part of a question being discussed? If yes, how does it affect it?
I'm not aware of that particular ship or vessel. Max, Lord, did that come up in any of y'all's research and preparation for today?
No.
No.
Okay.
Something that we can definitely look into and get back to, though.
Okay, great. Well, those are all the questions that we have today. Thank you for our presenters, Josh, Max, and Laura. Have a great rest of the week and look forward to seeing you at the next Beyond the Noise webinar.